Council and Planning Commission is called to order. The time is 6 p.m. Before we begin, Council and Commissioners, please put away cell phones. If you have personal business during the meeting, please move for a recess. As a reminder to all attendees, this meeting is being streamed live. The camera is located directly in the back of the council chambers above the clock. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councilmember Graham?
Here.
Councilmember Johnson?
Here.
Councilmember Crafton?
Here.
Councilmember Velock?
Here.
Councilmember Rubio, are you online?
Yes, here.
Thank you. Commissioner Cottle?
Here.
Commissioner Sajel?
Yeah.
Commissioner Seals?
Here.
Commissioner Stafford?
Here.
You do have a quorum, Madam Mayor, of both bodies.
Thank you. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And Ian, would you lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. The first item of business is approval of the agenda. Are there changes to the agenda? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as amended. Public participation. We don't have anyone, so I will close participation, public participation. We are on to unfinished business. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is a rewrite of Wasilla Municipal Code Title 16, which is our Land Development Code, Committee of the Whole. This is a continuation of Segment 4 from February 28th, 2024. And the attorney can correct me, but I believe our focus this evening is short-term rentals.
Is there a motion to enter the Committee of the Whole?
Madam Mayor, so moved by Councilman Johnson.
Is there a second?
Madam Mayor, I second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Johnson and seconded by Councilmember Crafton to enter the Committee of the Whole. Is there objection to the motion? Hearing none, we are now in Committee of the Whole. The time is 6:02 p.m. Madam Attorney, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Okay, so just as a preliminary matter, I am going to let you all know I am not feeling great today. So this is not going to be an exceptionally long session, but it was so important that we got through this because we are now at the end of our chapters, and I really didn't want to put it off. I know that we have budget, or you have budget sessions coming up, and so we really wanted to get in front of this so we could get to two next stages, I guess I would say. One is getting the draft with all of the incorporated recommendations and comments and thoughts. So I will ask you all to let me know if there's anything specific that you were not able to email or you haven't sent out that you want to make sure gets in that next draft. I want to make sure that we are doing that and turning our focus there. So we'll take that next step. The other thing I'm hoping to do is have a brief discussion on the comp plan and the next steps. I know the administration's been working on that, but that process, the RFP, the timing, that is something I at least want to get this joint body thinking about, because as we talk about definitions, one of the things I ran into when I started delving into creating materials for another session was where the line was, because the directive from council was put the Band-Aid, a meaningful Band-Aid on Title 16, deal with these issues, but don't go so far as to lead us into a discussion that somehow usurps the comp plan process, which on some of those issues. And so the definitions is really where I noticed, I started to feel that push and pull and wasn't sure where the line was. There's definitions that I certainly want to change, but what's happening in a particular district and what type of use you want where may influence how we define the words that we use to talk about those uses. So that's just sort of an overview of today. We're going to predominantly spend it on short-term rentals. I'm hoping we'll talk a little bit about the comp plan timing and process and next steps. And then I'm hoping to hopefully get some help from the city clerk to help us figure out what our timing looks like for our next segments as we move forward. So does anybody have any questions or any concerns about that approach? Okay, so we're going to delve right in. Councilmember Rubio, I will be sure to announce the pages as we go. Let's see,
Thank you.
I am growing. All right. So as you all know, we are, the city of Wasilla heavily regulates all the property within its borders. And that's one of the things that council and the commission have been working on, stepping back a bit, stepping back from that regulation. But before we change a regulation, it's important that we understand the current scheme. And we are actually, I am realizing I am walking you through everything that we were doing at this work session, but we are going to fast forward to the short-term rental section, so you don't have to listen to me drone on about all of this again. So let me move quickly to the first, so hold on, let me move quickly to the first slide, if I can do that. I'm sure there is a more efficient way to do this. I'm not very technologically advanced. Okay. Don't look. Okay. So currently the city heavily regulates short-term rentals, just like many of the other chapters in your code. I'm hoping that all of you will consider the following questions as we move forward today, and we're going to work through these together. Why does Wasilla regulate short-term rentals? What are the reasons that underlie these regulations? What are we trying to promote? What are we trying to prevent? What are the benefits of allowing short-term rentals, if there are any? Why would you want to allow them? Why would you want to reduce regulation, if at all? And so just really understanding, making sure our regulations in this city are deliberate and purposeful. What are the costs of short-term rentals? What are the costs of allowing short-term rentals to the community and the city of Wasilla? What are the regulatory options? What's happening in Alaska? What's happening outside Alaska? So we're going to talk about all of those things. So before we delve into this, and I'm going to start going through what your scheme really looks like, I do want to start with a conversation, which is why do we regulate short-term rentals? I think we have had a discussion about the legislative history. I mean, where this came from. The mayor gave us that in one of our earlier segments. But for the individual members, why do you want to regulate short-term rentals, or why do you not want to regulate them? Mayor, can we sort of see if there's anybody who wants to weigh in on that?
Sure. Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Madam Attorney. I don't want to regulate short-term rentals. I want our regulations to reflect what the public wants. And in my term on the council, there have been 3 truly hot-button items in 9 years. ATV use, okay, inside the city limits, marijuana within the city limits, and short-term rentals. So therefore, there is considerable appetite in the city, the residents of the city, the property owners in the city, to protect their property and their neighborhoods by regulating short-term rentals. So it's not a matter of what I want, it's a matter of what the public wants. And I think, those of you that have sat in on the planning commission meetings and things like that, the public has been quite vocal about short-term rentals and will continue to do so, because very few of them see it as being some sort of advantage to their neighborhood or to their way of life. So we do need to regulate it, but we also need to be very cognizant of the rights of property owners as well. But regulations we have now, I don't think are overburdensome. I think they were carefully thought out over probably, 4-month period. I mean, it was, and that was at the Planning Commission, and then we had a couple of hearings here where we, kind of fine-tuned them. Now we have some experience with the short-term rental market, so we can tune them up and get rid of some of the things and consolidate some things. But the regulations need to be there to protect the interests of the citizens and the property owners in Wasilla.
Thank you, that's very helpful. So one question I would have, so when the public is, what I heard from what you said is that they're worried about property, making sure they protect the values of their property, neighboring property, and what are the specific concerns that they raise? So I just want to make sure that we're starting from the same place as the public, right? So our provisions came from the public. Was it concerns with parking, and was it concern, what were the sort of the hot topics amongst the hot topic?
Yeah, I answered that.
Yes.
So I think I went to all the hearings at the Planning Commission, and obviously all of the City Council meetings dealing with that. Safety of the neighborhood was the number one thing. So traffic being increased or being unpredictable, streets being used by persons not familiar with that, on-street parking versus having adequate parking on-site, adequate snow storage, and noise, and I think what could be boiled down to immediate abatement when the rules are violated or when the rules are not followed.
Okay, and so the other question I would have is there any mechanism, so when we have a business that has a license that has a certain amount of parking spaces, or, for example, bed and breakfast, there are provisions in place in those districts and regarding that business, would that be a avenue you want to explore for regulation, or do you think that it's important to keep that separate? Because that was one of the things I struggled with your code, right? Like, a bed and breakfast isn't subject to all of these things, it's treated completely different, but the effective difference is a cup of yogurt left on the table in the morning, and so making sure that we don't already have the mechanisms in place to regulate something, but we've created another layer, making sure we don't do that. So do you think it's the short-term rental provisions that are necessary, or just the protections and the controls? How do you think that would play out in the public?
I don't think short-term rentals and bed and breakfast are even on the same planet. Bed and breakfast, you have somebody there supervising the property. They may not be there 24 hours a day, but there's somebody there that can go out and say, hey, you can't park your snow machine trailer on the street. Hey, it's, you need to hold down the noise. Hey, you can't have a big party over here. So there's somebody there, supervising the dorm, so to speak, while they're there. Whereas with a short-term rental, that on-site supervision is not there, and may in fact be hours away from that. So to me, that's kind of an apples and oranges kind of question. The difference is not the cup of yogurt on the counter in the morning. The difference is the ability to have that immediate abatement of nuisance, so to speak. But do they need to be regulated differently? I think so.
Well, and that is a very astute point, because it really stumbles onto the big difference that we see in a lot of other communities, which is they separate out owner-occupied short-term rentals from short-term rentals that are not owner-occupied. And so bed and breakfasts often are aligned and treated the same as owner-occupied short-term rentals. We don't differentiate. So all of the expectations that are placed on a non-owner occupied short-term rental are placed on an owner-occupied short-term rental, but not on a bed and breakfast. So we start to see that, and that's where we get those layers of where things start to, it's those layers that we add without being precise that sometimes start to erode the purpose and the intent of the code provision. So I think that's a really good starting point, which is, I guess, after we talk about, do we want to regulate it at all? You know, and I remember the comments from the last one, and I would say my feeling was that there was a desire to regulate it, or at least regulate registration, if nothing else. You know what I mean? That there was that coming from most of the members, but that what we have now is more than what individuals wanted to see. So if that's the case, and we should talk about that, but the question is there room to divide it into owner-occupied, not owner-occupied, and that way, you know, you're creating, you're really honing in on the risks that the public is concerned while protecting the property owners and their right to use their property.
Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Yes, thank you. I agree that there are two different entities here between short-term rental and then bed and breakfast owner occupied. However, I think there is one common feature that I think most of the people in the council is going to agree on. To run either organization, you need a business license. We have to pay sales tax. We want the revenue here. I mean, so I think within that we can separate it out with the one caveat: you need a business license to operate it.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a really good point. I think, you know, requiring businesses to operate as businesses, right, it's essential for a lot of other reasons, meaning then these short-term rentals start to look like a lot of other types of entities within your community that are expected to have a license. So having a license, I think that we would recommend that too, just from a legal perspective. The other thing is as I look at other communities having this conversation, there are consultants involved, there's a lot of number crunching, they're looking at what the neighborhood characteristics are as a whole and where the community wants to go. And these conversations, I think in some ways, Wasilla may have just been ahead of the average community, which is not unheard of here. You guys often are innovative. So a lot of these conversations are more sophisticated now. They're really comparing data that we didn't have access to. Now we have access by just turning to other communities and the consultants that they retained, because they're all looking at Alaska because it's all driven by tourism and that's all interconnected, right? So the other question is there any benefit as you consider a comp plan to creating a registration system by code that then starts building a database of information so you can figure out where are the short-term rentals, how are they running, what are their implications, what protections do we need? Is there any benefit to that, or is that, a lot of work to go halfway? I don't know, but that would be another option.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you for a follow-on question then. In leading into that particular thing, so if we were to use a registration system, is it possible to use the business licensing as a way of creating the criteria for which the either bed and breakfast or the short-term rental would operate under, with the caveat that the city could then pull the business license in either case for violations?
Yes, you can absolutely, when you have a when you have a registration and there's a violation, losing your right to do business within the city is an appropriate remedy to that violation. What a lot of people, so Juneau has a registration-based system. It's predominantly registration. There's some expectations on that you're in compliance with all of the laws, that that you're complying with zoning, and they pay attention to where they zone for short-term rentals, right? Where are they permitted? And all of those things, there's less, we regulate what goes into the rental agreements. We regulate in Wasilla, we regulate that you have to be 21 years old to rent a short-term rental, which is something you'll find in many short-term rentals, but rarely will you find it mandated by the local government. So you can imagine situations where you have a 21-year-old wanting to rent and, traveling that's okay to prevent them. it's probably okay. Age discrimination is a thing. It's a thing we have to be aware of as a government when we lay down, but I think it's reasonable. It's reasonable to say we're restricting rentals to a 21-year-old. But if you're going to take that step, which I cannot find an equivalent in Alaska and in another community, if we're going to take that step, then let's make sure we actually want to take that step. You know, that is something you guys are committed to, and it makes sense for the community. And that's all, because I do not mean to in any way denigrate the short-term rental code. But it's really, I'm looking at your purpose as stated by the bodies, and I want to make sure that short-term rental code still reflects the goals of, you know, of the community. So a couple of other things. So when we're looking, let me pause there really quick. This is a big conversation. I feel like we have several big questions, and so I'm going to be eager to jump into the next one. And I am relying on all of you to pull me back to the first question if we haven't really got to an answer. So I think I actually see some questions.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Crafton?
Thank you. I like the idea of the registration, because again, we do want to keep tabs on what's happening. I personally just think the regulations we have in place are way overburdensome to the owners of the property. I'm curious to see what the public would have to say about it, because some of the general feedback I've been getting is they don't like it. And I get, when this was put in place, the feedback at that time was short-term rentals were still fairly new thing happening. And I think over time we're realizing, like, maybe in some communities are different. I mean, you look at a community like Juneau or Homer or Seward or something where they have a little bit more of that seasonality type of tourism. So they're seeing more struggles with their short-term rentals, whereas we don't see that quite as much. So I wonder if we're at that point where, yeah, like you said, we were ahead, and we said the public was saying, hey, we need to do this. And so we're like, okay, great. Yeah, you're right. Let's do this. And now we're going, wait a second. This might not have been, maybe we jumped too far ahead. And so I like the idea of the registration. I think one of the things to keep in mind, and I think everybody else would agree as well, would be keeping it out of like the R1 zoning. You know, that's a big thing, because I mean, I might be wrong, but I want to say bed and breakfasts are allowed there because they're technically an owner-occupied property. And so that's one of those weird discrepancies, like you're saying, where we're going, bed and breakfast is an owner-occupied property. Where's the line between between bed and breakfast and short-term rental is what you were mentioning. So I think there needs to be some guardrails around short-term rentals. I sat on the planning commission for, I want to say I believe we still only had 3 permits come forward. And there was public feedback, and the most common ones were what Mr. Graham was mentioning. People, transient, the safety of the neighborhood, and really breaking up the rules were the two topics that I heard were the biggest concern. So I'd like to see them rolled back a little bit and stuck more under the business licensing, but saying, hey, we're just not going to allow it in the R1 zones, for instance. So that'd be my thought on it.
Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, it's already in code about where you can have these.
Yes, yeah, and we can go to the district use chart, which I can flip back
Madam
through.
Mayor,
But
just to follow up to your
Sure.
comment there. I was just saying, because I didn't want us to like roll it back and then allow it in R1 all of a sudden, because we changed
right.
it. So I just want to make sure that was still clear.
And where does a neighborhood, or whatever you want, how you want to describe it, where is their covenants, or what will that do? I mean, if a neighborhood could regulate by using their own covenants.
yes, a subdivision that has a homeowners association, you know, they will often have covenants that regulate short-term rentals, and there's a lot of times what you see is them regulating owner-occupied, but a lot of condos, a lot of homes don't allow short-term rentals. And so those are the questions, right? I mean, wanting regulation and needing to be the regulator are not always the same thing, and knowing what that really looks like. For example, a lot of communities that do restrict districts where short-term rentals appear, a lot of them do the owner-occupied versus not owner-occupied becomes very important to them, because they want, as Councilmember Crafton is saying, that control, that understanding of this property is going to be maintained. We're not gonna end up with a party that's trashing the neighborhood, right? So there's that option. There is, but that's when we run into the other question with short-term rentals, which is, are we now butting up against the comp plan? And when we're talking about where we want to allow it, is that different than what we want to regulate on this front end, right? So a lot of our questions, and that's similar to when we started talking Title 16 and making sure we do this rewrite, part of it was to get our procedures cleaned up. And so the biggest concerns I have with short-term rentals are concerns that, because I think Wasilla was innovative and on the front end of these regulations, we are seeing before others are even adopting their code. And one of them is an annual permitting process for short-term rentals. I think that creates a problem because we have an appeals process. So we allow people to appeal the decisions we make on their short-term rentals, and that appeal process takes the majority of the time of right? It will take 4 months out of a 12-month permit process, for example. And during that time, their ability to use their permit is automatically stayed. So they cannot use their permit. So they've been awarded a permit or it's been approved. They then lose half of the use of the permit, if not more, and then they are guaranteed to start that process again. And because it's been appealed once, it's I think a property owner would anticipate fairly that it'll be appealed again. And so what we have done is effectively prevented that individual from having a sensible business plan at the very least, right? Because who is going to engage in a permitting process where they spend half of each permit every year fighting to have the permit and unable to use that property for the purposes that they were approved, that were approved. And we don't have the ability, when we have a permit and an appeal process, to say, well, we're not going to allow you to appeal again because you appealed once and lost. Because time is fluid and facts are different. So we at very least would need to show that the facts were exactly the same, that they were appealing on exactly the same reason, and that is why we're foreclosing it, and that is a lot of administrative work. So even just to show that they're foreclosing an appeal in the future would be a lot of work. So the question becomes, why an annual permitting process? Why do we not have a permitting process and then require some level of, you need to submit X to us every year? We need to, because we have an enforcement process. So if they're not complying with their permit, and so they still go through the appeal process, but then they've obtained something that has meaning beyond the period. So if that makes sense. So that's just one thing. So that's a permitting, that's what we fixed here. We eliminate that no matter what, we have another version. We have the total repeal, but we have another version that cleans up that, no annual permit, just a permitting process. We reduce the regulations to ensure that you are still regulating it, but you're not regulating what goes in the agreement. You're regulating on a much more, it's an easier permitting process to enforce, or regulation to enforce. So, Mayor, I think you have
Eric?
I just want to piggyback on that. So Holly said a couple of really important things. I think you do need to first start with talking about what you want to regulate. Don't get into where you want to not allow it at first. You only have 9 R1 zones in the whole city, and they look exactly like rural residential. I can't see any difference in half of the rural residential to the R1s. There's not any difference in property sizes. They don't look any different when you drive through them. So to select R1 and say no, that cuts out 75% of Lake Lucille shoreline, right? And so it's too early to talk about where it can't be if you haven't talked about how you're going to regulate it. And I think that's the most important thing, is to start with what a good short-term rental looks like, and when you need to regulate because the activities there are outside of what this body wants to see. Because we don't have that much space that we manage, right? And so the valley as a whole has a lot of really pretty places. All these homes on little lakes are, quaint little places that'd be a really nice short-term rental. And we only have 1.5 lakes that we have properties around. And so I think talk about the regulation that you want, and then if you need to get specific about zoning and controls, that's the time to do it.
Thank you.
And as an example, one thing to note too, as we talk about these different communities, that was an excellent point. I completely agree with everything there, just for the record, because I do think it's so important to get our base purpose and reason underlying our regulations solidified. But one of the things I would say, so the Kenai Peninsula has 2,000. This was a PowerPoint prepared by a consultant for Anchorage, but the Kenai Peninsula Borough has 2,149 short-term listings in 2022, right?
Are you looking at a specific?
Oh,
Yeah, I was
yes.
just about to ask
Oops.
what page. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. That would be page 82 of 188 in your packet. And thank you for catching. So when you get there, just says short-term rental data, and you'll see there's 2 slides. And you see in 2022, so Kenai Peninsula with, which has 31,000 housing units total approximately, has 2,149 short-term listings. And the Matsu Borough with 42,000 approximately housing units, so not very different, right, has 903. And that's the entire, that's Matsu Borough as a, within the boundaries of the borough. So I think a lot of us, I believe there's a lot of communities within the borough that I expect have a much higher number of short-term rentals than Wasilla, right? So you can imagine what part of the pie we're talking about when we're talking about short-term rentals. And it helps us identify, even proportionally, you look at 13,000 housing units total in Juneau and 379 short-term rentals. So their capacity and the impact of short-term rentals on some of these communities is different than Wasilla. And I'm not saying how that factors in. I just want you to be aware of it as we talk about it, because there is a difference with the number. We're not talking, I think, and maybe that is, and the question is that good or bad? Does Wasilla want more short-term rentals? Is it a business? When we talk about business development, is that a business that we want to develop? Because short-term rentals is in fact a business, right? It is it's just like talking about hotels, or, when they are paying sales tax and when they're subjected to that, then they are a business owner within your community. So it's something to think about. Or do we not consider short-term rentals a business owner within our community for some other, for another reason? But I think we need to be, because of, I guess I shouldn't say another reason, because of the potential harm. I think communities that do not give short-term rentals the same sort of credibility as other businesses generally come from a place of protection, right? So the biggest one that I see is you have a small community, short-term rentals come into the residential neighborhoods, someone is able to buy a house for substantially more money than they would be able to pay in order to live in it, because now they're going to use it as a business. So they drive up the price of the house, and then somebody else who wants to buy a house to live in cannot afford to live in that neighborhood because the short-term rental market has driven up the cost. At the same time, the individuals running the short-term rental are not they're a business, and so their interest in schools and roads and all of these things are separate and apart. Some maybe in some ways the same, but what they want from a perspective of a business and not a resident, an individual resident. One question Wasilla needs to grapple with is that a risk that Wasilla needs to protect against? Do you anticipate an influx of short-term rentals to such a degree that it will change the composition of your community? And I don't know the answer to that question. That's a question but I think that's the first question. If we're gonna regulate, why are we regulating? That's one reason I see. The other reason is housing crises. If every available home and condo is used for short-term rentals, what's used for long-term rentals? That's a reason. The reason of these homes or these businesses will result in more crime, more parking, traffic issues, things like that, of that nature. That's a reason, so those are the three reasons. And whether or not you give credence to those reasons, I think the first reason for me is the most powerful. I see the evidence that happens. I do not see evidence that happens in a community with the configuration of Wasilla. Just from what I'm seeing, when I look at where that happens when you are able to saturate a market so beach communities, right? In San Diego, it's just these little neighborhoods that are close to the beach are suddenly multi-million-dollar homes, and nobody's really living in these homes on a regular, so you see it and it's palpable. So, but you might see it in a small community, like Sitka or something like that. I could see that happening, but I don't know about Wasilla, not a question for a lawyer. So.
Madam Mayor? I think it's on.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Do we know how many short-term rentals we currently have in Wasilla? Do we have any idea? Okay, because, we are regulating right now that we limit it to 75 with, any one owner can only hold 3 permits. Yeah, I don't know if this is working or not.
No, it is. Yes, it's on. Green light.
And I think without a registration, you're not gonna know how many are out there. And I think that might be a key factor for us to gather the data that we need. But we do currently regulate to 75. So I don't know if, the worry about it saturating neighborhoods and housing market with a limit like that is really gonna be applicable or not. But I'm not in the real estate business, so I don't know.
So, and that leads to an excellent point, because the question is why 75? So that is one of the things that in the other draft, if there was, I lifted it. So, and it doesn't mean I can't go back in, but one of the reasons being, we should not write, I don't know how many short-term rentals we. So.
Eric?
So I went to Airbnb and I zoomed out to roughly the boundary of Wasilla, and it says there's 46 Airbnbs that I could sort through right now, just on that one's website. So I would assume there's some cross posting, but I would say that's at least only 50% of what's probably out there if we think of one site and 46 being listed.
That's helpful. I think that gives us some, because most sites and most properties, I do think generally.
They want people to know about them,
Yes,
so they're not going to
more than
hide.
one
And so
site, yeah.
that's the thing to understand too, is that, so Juneau did a study on short-term rentals because they have a housing crisis, and they're like, it's the short-term rentals, they're doing it to us. And so Brian Holst over at the Juneau Economic Development Group led a study, like $100,000 to figure out what was wrong. And they weren't the demons they were made out to be. It was the demographic change. So Juneau's losing families, I'm one of them, and they're singles or doubles, right? There are not 7 people living in a house. It's a couple or a single person, and so they're spreading out, and so that's where there's that push for housing. Where was I going with this? But so it's a major burden to track them down. We will, Maureen and our sales tax group will have to become internet sleuths to figure out who's online, who's using what platform, kind of like online sales, making sure that Amazon shipments within the city limits get our sales tax like they're supposed to. But there is going to be a whole tracking regime that has to start to make sure that whatever regulation we set up is being adhered to, because we stumble across them, but they're not in too many different websites. It's less than a dozen. And that will be one of the expectations, is to go and find them and say, I found you on the site. I have no record of you. You need to deal with us. And then it's a game of cat and mouse, because, you know, we deal with that in all different businesses, right? Coffee shops, everything. You need to come in. We know your sales tax is more than it is. Why isn't it adding up? And that's a ton of work.
We have had 3 permits for short-term rentals, and 2 of those were appealed. But then the one that is currently licensed as a short-term rental, they say, okay, why do I have to pay when all these others are not? So to me, yeah, we need to know a business license, and we need your sales tax. And we need a few regulations. But if you make them too heavy, they're not gonna do it. And I mean, to me, it's already been proven, they're not gonna do it with what regulations we've got going on now. And in order, if you're, depending on how you regulate them, like Eric said, we're gonna have to hire more people. So, if you have to hire one more person, are you going to collect enough money from these short-term rentals to pay for that person's salary, benefits, all of that? Is it gonna be worth it to the city?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
so we heard traffic brought up as one of the concerns with short-term rentals. And after the planning commission considered one of the permits, I did some looking, and I found a study, it was out of, I believe it was out of Southern California, and they identified that just a residential home produced like 8 trips a day, coming and going to work, to pick up the kids, to go to the store. A hotel produced like 4 trips a day per person, and a short-term rental only produced 3.5 trips a day. So I don't think the traffic argument, and that was just one study, I couldn't find much else. It's, you know, short-term rentals are a new phenomena. It didn't seem like the traffic complaint was a legitimate, in my opinion, was a legitimate concern. And I've got a neighbor that's been next to me for 12 years, and he's got 2 camp trailers in the driveway, a utility trailer, a car that hasn't ran in 5 or 6 years, and he parks on the street. So I kind of wish I had a short-term rental next door, because maybe they wouldn't be doing that, you know? And so, I mean, if we're gonna be concerned about people parking on the street, that's gonna probably come from a resident way before it comes from a short-term renter. So if we're gonna regulate parking on the street, and then that's, you know, a whole other can of worms. And maybe we already regulate that. I just haven't found it in the code yet. But so I know those are some of the concerns raised, and also along with the available housing for long-term residents is the other concern. But I think some of the concerns brought up by people against them are not legitimate concerns. It just is an assumed concern.
Tim?
Madam Mayor, to Eric or Crystal, you said that we have approximately 46 listings of Airbnbs. I mean, do we have a category of business license for such a, I mean, this should be something we could create a database within the city quite quickly. It wouldn't take a lot of administration.
Through the mayor to Councilmember Johnson, that is an excellent question, because normally you would go to an NAIC code for an estate, but there's no code. It's all lodging. So then you start relying on these platforms like VRBO and Airbnb, where they'll bring your attention to those in your area that they know are operating. So just recently in our conversation with them, they identified 26. And so 26 letters went out to these known operating short-term rentals in zones that were either allowed or not allowed. And as you guys had indicated, then they started reporting all their neighbors that are also doing it that didn't get a letter. Why did he get a letter and I didn't get a letter? How do you answer that? So the data is really hard to find unless you go to these VRBOs and Airbnbs. That was one of the other things at the Planning Commission that was brought up by neighbors is, well, we know if Mr. Johnson rents an apartment or rents a room, but we don't know and we don't trust these platforms, if my memory serves me well, to clearly screen the people that are coming for 3 days. So, but right now there's 26 that we know, and those 26 have not called back.
Violation of sales tax.
And I do. So for me, my goal, my objective, just as your attorney, is to make sure you have regulations in place, that you have laws that you want to and can enforce, and that you do not have laws that do not reflect your objectives and that you do not enforce, right? And so that doesn't mean there's always, and it's really important to recognize that there is discretion, and there is, one year has certain resources and certain priorities, and so it is not, I do not want the city mandated to enforce every permit at all, because that's not how the world works. But it is, for me, having a system that lays out an incredibly rigid criteria for the regulation of a particular type of business, without every one of you, or at least the vast majority, being like, this, we are protecting our community, this is why we need this is why it works, it brings in sales tax revenue, we use that revenue, like that passion needs to be coming from the regulating bodies, because it takes a lot of resources to implement. So, and I think you absolutely legally have a right to regulate it, right? But the registration process might be, from everything I'm hearing, just to bring us to a potential decision for all of you to, so please, I have very thick skin to sort of respond to. I think maybe starting with a registration provision, repealing the short-term rental regulations, incorporating and clarifying the license mandate, that there is, that you need to have a license and what that looks like, so we can track and make sure we get revenue, but we make it very easy for short-term rental owners to participate and comply, so we get a feeling for the universe and what the costs are. Then make sure that we flag regulations, including our current regulations and all of the legislative history that shows why those were so important, why those provisions matter, and maybe where we need to go again. We combine that with all of the data we've now gathered on short-term rentals, and we make sure that that is front and center during the comp plan process. So first, because I just spewed that out, I would turn to the administration and see what they think, and then maybe we can get responses. Okay.
So,
Through the mayor to the council, I just want to bring some stats to you. So we've had 8 applications since we passed the regulation. 1 was denied, 2 permits were issued, 2 applications were received, but they haven't come back, and 2 were closed. So I don't know, I'll have to look in the system, see why they were closed, but Holly's right. They go to get a license, a business license with good intention. They come over to planning. There's 11 steps that they have to take, including notifying all of their neighbors within 1,200 feet. We have to have that back. Then they go in front of the planning commission. If it's approved, not a problem, but their neighbors have adequate time to appeal. then there's a process. In one particular case, we had it appealed twice, and I don't think there's any sales tax that have been collected to date because they missed the whole season in the appeal process. So they said, we'll just go ahead and do a long-term rental.
Right,
Mr.
Mayor?
Graham?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think we got the cart in front of the horse here. I think we have to recognize that we are a government first, not a business first. We're in the business of government, but we're a government first. And the function of the government is primarily protection of the people and the assets, of the people. And in this case, the government owns assets, roads, fire departments, that sort of thing, so we protect those as well. So I think that's where we need to start. What level of protection do we want? And then we can look and see, well, this level of protection costs this much, and no, that's too much money. Maybe we need a little bit less protection. But I think the idea there is we have to focus on the function of government, not the cost of government. The function of government needs to be the first concern, and then the cost comes in, and that may determine the scope of function of the government.
No, I think that works too. And when you're looking at regulation and protection, or whether it's just registration, and, I think it is important to, what are you trying to protect, and how do you do that in a way that reflects, the intentions of the members? So I guess this would be another one where I kind of want to hear from all of you. So we proposed the registration process, and I think, Councilmember Graham, are you, when you say the cart in front of the horse, are you saying that you'd probably prefer to just leave the regulation as stands for now and then explore any other options after the comp plan? Or I just want to, could you clarify a little bit so I just make sure we know?
Certainly, my apologies for not making that clear. I'm not saying that we should leave the existing framework in place, but we should look at why the existing framework is in place. So the function of the government was to determine the needs of the property owners and the citizens and protect the rights of the citizens and the health and safety of the citizens. And that's where that framework of regulations came from, or framework of administrative gobbledygook came from. So we just need to make sure that we're keeping the function foremost. And if we say, well, we're going to wipe out the regulations altogether, have we changed then the function of the government when it comes to short-term rentals in different neighborhoods and so on and so forth? So I agree that what we've got now, it looked pretty damn good 3 years ago when we put it in place. And it's still not bad, but it is not accomplishing everything that we set out to do, because part of the function of the government is to grow the community or to make the community more desirable. And because our administrative process for getting a permit is somewhat onerous, it hasn't allowed investment in our community like you would see in other communities our size, and part of the function when we talked about putting the regulations in place was to keep people from coming in and buying up a bunch of affordable housing rentals and putting them out there, because if you're going to go rent a place for a weekend, you're probably not going to rent the nicest place you can find. You're going to rent, the kind of average place, which has potential to be bought up. So what happens is you now have these nicer properties available, and then you have the very low end properties available. But that middle strata there is being picked up and not available for families to rent or to buy. But we need to look at what the function is there. And now that we actually have some data and we have other communities both in and outside Alaska to look at, we can say, well, this process now, this permit process, doesn't work. You know, this 1,200-foot thing, really? I mean, is 1,200 feet, so that's a lot of real estate. You know, so do we really need 1,200 feet for rental? It's not like we're putting in a bar, you know, we're gonna rent my house out for a couple of nights. So yeah, I am not in favor of shelving the whole thing, but I am in favor of reviewing, of looking at the function of the regulatory system that's in place and the specific pieces of that are in place before we say, well, this isn't working the way we wanted. Let's start over. Well, we've already got the start of a wheel. Let's just polish it up a little bit and make it more round. So.
Eric?
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Graham's comments are great because I wanted to, you mentioned safety, and I didn't want to miss an opportunity to share something that I learned through working closer with the fire marshal on our hydrant project and stuff. You know, he looks at life and safety as worst case scenario. He sees tragedy all the time. And he says, well, you have visitors to our community in a short-term rental, and it's a house, and it feels like a house, but it's not their house, so they're not capable of walking through the house in the dark like we can because we know it. So how do they get out safely? So he's thinking on the more commercialized side, like more fire extinguishers, better fire systems, like ladders out windows, stuff that my personal opinion is I don't want that in my house. But what you see is, and Mr. Graham, you kind of touched on this, the way we use it, the way we understand the system is changing, and so it is good to reevaluate as we learn more and as the system changes slightly to say, you know, what regulation do we want? How do we provide the safety and the oversight that we want? And how do we protect against broad property issues? You know, like you said, certain class properties being gobbled up. The other thing, oh man, I just lost it. The other thing I was going to mention was, so as the market changes, they are now advertising that kind of like in the Airbnb, the bed and breakfast model. You rent a house, but then something goes wrong. Who do I call? Who do I call? They're now being very upfront saying you are not alone. We have a call taker ready to take your call immediately if you run across something in your house. Does that make sense? And so that's a new marketing trend in the last couple years because they're so popular that they're finding that a water leak starts and you're running around, you have no idea. You just rented the place and now you realize you're unprepared to react to a home issue. And so these businesses are building in a new concierge service, if you will, so that you don't feel alone if something crazy happens because there is no homeowner on site with you. And I think I don't think a regulator said do that. I think the businesses said, we're getting bad reviews. We need to build in this support because our customers are coming back to us and saying, that freaked me out or whatever they experience. But you can see business saying, yeah, we want to provide that for you. And now it's a benefit. I only rent with XYZ because I know I have a person on the other end of the line in the middle of the night if something crazy happens. And I'm not alone because, you know, I think a lot of people too, they like the idea that there's like in motel, hotel, there's a manager to call for help, right? And so they originally liked the freedom, but then they realize there are reasons I need to call someone and I need them to react right away for my benefit. So anyway, I didn't want to not say what the fire marshal was thinking about. It kind of goes into, just for your edification too, the idea of like group homes for elderly care and stuff. He's very concerned about the permitting process on that because in that example, you have elderly people who cannot move very fast, and they might be in a house that wasn't built with the mechanisms to evacuate vulnerable people. And so he's looking at the worst case scenario, and they kind of cross uses. And so that was just an interesting learning opportunity on my part to see what his daily concerns and fears are for protecting our community.
And that is one thing too. We could always come with a robust registration process, which means it's a registration process, but it has in place, you know, you need to provide the name and number of your local manager who's available, which that reflects what we have now. We have a local manager requirement in our code right now. that is one that I think is a really powerful one to have for a lot of reasons, right? You want to decide local contact, but that usually you can attach, that will be available to the property within 24 hours, you know, and so you, but what we also have now is a residency requirement. I don't think that's appropriate. So I think that needs to come out of the code. So, and because residency is intent, so where we live is a matter of intent. So I can live in Wasilla for a year and I can be available all the time. And I am not a resident of Wasilla if I think I'm a resident of Palmer, right? You know, so I mean, I can make an argument, but that becomes, so we don't want to get into a debate about that. I think it's best to regulate. We want someone here, we want them available. You need a local manager, you know, and they need to be able to get to the property within a period of time. And I think that there's ways to incorporate that into registration, that compliance with laws, tax paying, you know, paying their taxes, all of their taxes, right? So that's another one. So that might be a place to start. But is there anybody else who wants to weigh in, or I feel
Melvin?
like people maybe are still a little conflicted.
You're the
on
real
this.
estate guy.
Real estate guy.
I know, he's already spoke. It's your turn.
Madam Mayor, I think you're picking on me.
No, I'm not.
No, I agree there has to be some regulation. I don't think it should be overbearing or extremely arduous. I think we have to take into account what the residents think, even if some of it is just their angst with having a short-term rental, you know, in their area. So I think there has to be some regulation, because you gotta have some left and right limits, or some people will just go totally off the rails, and then you'll have all kinds of other problems. I did have a question though concerning the age limit of 21. Does anybody know why that was put in there? Is that something that hotels use when they rent out rooms?
Well, I will say, I don't know why, and maybe Councilmember Graham, do you know why? I mean, but I will tell you this, almost all Airbnbs, a lot of them will impose in their own agreement, they will not rent to people under 21. You know, so it's certainly, and that is the thing about this industry, it's a review-based driven industry. So there are a lot of, I don't know how many of you pulled up an Airbnb recently, but if you go to house rules, you will often find quite a bit of detail. So the question is, they are regulating just like a long-term renting landlord regulates their, you know, with a 5-page lease and lots of details. The Airbnbs, the short-term rentals, they generally regulate because they have property at stake. They have a business interest that can be destroyed. If someone throws a party and destroys their building, then they have lost an investment. So I think it's just, then whether or not, you know, Wasilla decides to regulate that as well in order to, and this is a really important point, as Councilmember Graham said, to add that layer of protection for your community, that is appropriate, is very appropriate, but I just want to make sure it's intentional. So that's, if that makes sense.
Mr. Gray?
And getting back to your question of why the 21 came up, I mean, that was talked about in each of the sessions where regulation of short-term rentals came up, and it was protection of the property from persons generally that do not have assets. So you go in and you do $5,000 worth of damage to a property, which doesn't take a whole lot, by the way. You know, what are your chances of recovering that from somebody under 21? It's just like in the car rental business. You know, if you're under 25, you can't rent a car. You know, but just because they don't feel that you have the assets where they can go after you and recover their losses. So, and that was recommended by someone from, I believe it was from California, that talked about the rental market in California. They didn't allow people under 21.
And so, you know, and that is interesting because my first thought is the property owner, if they are going to lose their assets, is going to protect them. But if we're talking about the assets of, say, a neighbor or something, right, then they can collect against the property owner. and they don't need to correct the renter, and so the property owner is responsible for the renter, or are they, right? So that to me is very important, because what it means is creating making sure that the property owner is responsible for damages done to, and can we do that? And I think we try to do that, and the question is, how far can we do that? And making sure we know that.
Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The general consensus at most of the hearings for short-term rentals were neighbors that said, not in my neighborhood. The actual businesses that made a presentation, they're looking out for their best interest, and like you say, it's a review process in that industry, and if you get bad reviews, you're not going to have much business at that location. So I like the registration part the best. That way the city can capture information and bring in the proper revenue from the sales and the rentals on those properties.
And one thing we could do too, if you do go the registration route, you could sunset it. So you can set a registration, in code, then sunset it so that you are ready and primed to deal with the data from the registration and make sure you're considering more robust regulations. But we can also, I feel like this is the first time, I feel like 4 segments, we made it right to the end where we are, I'm hearing expressions of kind of different takes on the level of regulation. So I feel like, this is exciting now. So we get to actually duke it out. To that end, I think maybe bringing more than one option. I have an option prepared that is a regulation light. It really just takes out the things that I have reasons for recommending against. And then if we add a registration piece, which is going to encompass a lot of those, if we do registration heavy, right? So registration with a hint of regulation, right? So we're getting the max occupancy. I think a max occupancy is a great idea. You see it in most communities. The reason why I like it is it levels the playing field by person. So concerns by the fire marshal, concerns regarding particular districts, wherever you decide to allow something, you get it down to an actual number of people. So multifamily can have 10 people, or an individual family may have up to 10 people or whatever it is. Then you max out the short-term rental at that number too, for a non-owner occupied. So, or that amount plus, so you can then figure out your parking, you can figure out all of those things. You have a max number now. So, that's one way. So I don't know how we feel about that. I'll take your pulse on that, and then I'll run through the slides, because of course I think I got ahead of myself a little bit.
Nikki, you want to weigh in?
Well, I was actually on the planning commission during the creating of the short-term rental agreements. And it was kind of, we had a lot of public input, and it was definitely on Wasilla Lake, we'd have people come in, and it was more like Commissioner Seals says, just not in my neighborhood. They'd say, 4th of July, some people were renting and they were shooting off fireworks. They didn't like that. Maybe noise. They just really didn't like anything. And the planning commission at the time, everything that was brought up, it was like the planning commission just adopted it. How about we make it 21? Okay, honestly, all this little stuff, they need a sign that has, who they can call. We'll put this right here. Well, I think we need to have it right over here too. Okay, we'll do both. And it kind of went like that, and pretty soon it just grew and grew and grew and grew. But to our defense, we really didn't have a lot to go on, so we thought you can always back it up. We'll put it all in, and what doesn't work or what business owners are having problems with, then we'll just kind of back it out. So that's how I remember it.
Elena,
Yes.
you wanna weigh in?
Yeah, I think we're hitting it for sure. Hopefully you guys can understand me.
We can.
Okay. I think I like the idea of Holly's. I would like to see that laid out where there's less regulations, even though we have the parameters out there. I like the idea of the registration and then being able to keep track of that. And of course, when they have all that, then the sales tax will be coming in. So then we can regulate that way too. And keep in mind, we don't have manpower anywhere in the world right now, and definitely not even in our own backyard. So we don't want to add another job to anybody at the city. And we don't want to go into the business of, small rentals. So I just think that we are on the right direction, but I don't think that I like what we have right now proposed in front of us.
Okay. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, yes, I think the registration, tying the registration to a business license is one way to do it. Another thing that we should do is to eliminate some of the detailed restrictions to it, such as like number 10, we have very detailed things. Well, the intent here is a residential overnight activity, no group activities would cover all of that. So get rid of some of the details that were in here. The over 21, that's a detail. But what is missing is, okay, we're trying to protect both the neighborhood and the city, but I see nowhere that we really require business insurance. Okay, if you're going to say that the owner is going to be responsible for liability for damages of his guest, well, you better have a requirement in there that he has business insurance. Okay, so if you're going to make a business out of it, do it correctly and put that kind of information in the code, and then get rid of some of the details. Thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Kathy?
We do currently, in our current code, have a requirement of $1 million liability, which is double the amount that a lot of other communities have. A lot of the other communities are at 500,000, and in our code, it says million. So that is a requirement.
Madam Mayor, a quick question. If we roll back all these regulations, we simplify it, and you've got a bad property owner that's renting to younger people, and there's parties, and there's fireworks, and there's cars on the street, do we have something elsewhere in our code to deal with a nuisance property owner, whether it's a short-term rental or someone running an illegal dog kennel or a junkyard? Is there other mechanisms in place than just a heavy-handed short-term rental?
Yes, we have a nuisance provision, so it would get to a lot of those
So that would
concerns.
solve a lot of it.
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, I want to add a couple things to that too.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things we started discussing on the planning commission was what the city doesn't have is blanking on it, 10 o'clock, quiet hours. That's what it was. I think curfew time, thank you. I know we are starting to have that conversation right as my time left, and that might be something that, again, I think there's other ways to handle some of the problems that we experience with the short-term rentals. I think that is where it is, instead of just saying, here, we're gonna limit everything through here. Why don't we put up some other type of way? Because then it's not directly targeting short-term rentals. It's actually creating a little bit broader of a scope of, well, hey, you've just got a noisy neighbor that likes to throw parties at midnight, and they're not short-term rentals type of thing. It's a broader scope of what you're looking at. I also wanted to add in as well about just the real estate aspect of this and what I've seen out on the market. I mean, we're not seeing so many people, like you mentioned, where they're bidding up home prices because of short-term rentals. And a lot of that is because if they go up too high on the price, it doesn't pencil out anymore. It's like a rental, if you buy it at X price, it has to be able to rent for more than that. So if I pay too much for this property, it no longer makes sense for them. And short-term rental is the same exact way. The math is just slightly different. So, I mean, and I think this is also this on that page 82 that you showed us. 903 Matsu Borough rentals in Q2 of 2022. And when you think about it, how many of them are actual single-family homes? Most of the time you think of a short-term rental, you're usually looking at some type of condo, an apartment, something smaller, quainter, because you're not always needing such a massive house. Are there some out there? Yes, but they're usually like a lake home or something. You know, it's this really big house and somebody's trying to rent it for that specific type of purpose. Are there some of those average style homes? Yes, but I haven't really seen as many of those is what I've seen. So I think what we've been provided actually does help show that, again, we need to keep the protection aspect in place and not be looking at this like a business.
And that's all very helpful, and Councilmember Wheelock's comments actually are very helpful for me, because what she emphasized, this sort of, it was very, it was a reactionary sort of approach to try to make sure all of the things that they were seeing were addressed. That makes complete sense when I look at the criteria, you know, so that's really, that's helpful, because it helps me understand where we came from.
Eric?
I was at a couple planning commission meetings because I had my own permits I had to get for city stuff. And like Ms. Vlock said, there was a lot of like, we don't want unknown people in our neighborhoods. And I thought that was a little bit odd, you know, because it's a strange position because there's no gates, you know, and I think what Mr. Crafton talked about was there's a couple models that people tend to employ for short-term rentals. They'll find a home or a property that they already own and they've got margin, and they can look at the market and they can say, if I rent that out half the month, that'd be pretty good. I could carry it's work. You have to turn it over, you have to get it ready. If you don't like being a housekeeper, then you have to find someone who will be your housekeeper, and that's not cheap. And so the costs add up, and you've got to be really smart about your revenue versus your costs. And so that's going to knock a lot of wishful thinking out the window for real feasibility, right? But there are some destination homes, like the lakefront one. I was looking at one that's almost $600 a night. Beautiful. Kayaks, fire pits. You could have a lot of people there, and it could get rowdy, and it could be rowdy every night. Because if you live there, you could be rowdy for a little while, but then you tire yourself out, and your neighbor's like, oh, good, they're not partying tonight. So I think the discussion about just general neighborly behavior, if a quiet time was enacted, or if there's just some minor changes to what a good neighbor looks like and there's some code enforcement ability. Truthfully, code enforcement is not running around after 5 p.m., right? So it's going to be a after hours police call that comes in. And so it's just these natural, like, do we pick on short-term rental, or do we say Wasilla has some expectations about friendly neighborhood behavior, and you know, that's outside my purview. It's just an observation. But then there's also the market where it is so the house isn't the destination. It's not on the lake. There aren't the kayaks and I think one place had a slide and maybe a boat and stuff like that. I'm coming to town to go to Menard Center. I need some place to stay because we got a hockey tournament. So ironically, the Arctic Winter Games are completely testing our infrastructure, right? We will see next week how we do. So it's a good time to be talking about it, and I recommend everyone look around. Get online now. I was looking to see what the costs were, and I forgot to change the date, and I tried to find a place in town for Arctic Winter Games. You could pay $300 for a shed if you want to, and there's one spot, but it is full. And so this will be the most pressure we've ever felt with regular housing market. Everything is sold out. And so just be mindful of that and just see what happens to the community. And anyway, and you might even, if you want to dive into it, is just figure out, you can figure out where they are by going way into the future and saying, you know, I want to come here in August, and you can see them all pop up again. And that's where you'll know where they are, and then you can just see what the neighborhood impacts are, and then talk to your neighbors. And I think it'd just be really interesting to place yourself over the next week in a place to receive community input, feedback on how we did this winter with 8,000 people coming into town and maxing us out on every bit of infrastructure.
Holly, they said that there was, 60 rentals or whatever it was?
9.
46 on my number.
Okay, 46.
Oh.
But, have we gotten any complaints about any disturbances in the neighborhoods or anything? I've not heard of any.
That's a good question. We should
So-
ask the chief.
They must be doing something right.
And we can make sure we gather that data too, to make sure, because they would come in, I would assume they'd come in as a nuisance call. Councilmember Bielek, when you were on the planning commission, was there a discussion about calls, or, I mean, was it honed in on, with the 4th of July emphasis, was it honed in on, because maybe that is, and that is another thing, the max, the number of occupants a lot of times is aimed at shutting down massive parties, so when you have these big houses and they rent to like 20 people. And I think throughout the state, I see 10 to 12. I don't see anything above that. Most of the maxes cap at 10 to 12 people. But that's something we could incorporate in the registration. But so that was what you were seeing is more
Madam Mayor?
it's loud.
Yeah, and the one I'm thinking about on Wasilla Lake, I mean, it had, I think, 15 people max. And they had some big, like, wedding parties and things like that. But the business owners, they would come too, and they were very reasonable. They would do anything they could on their end to make it nice for the neighborhood, and they were very willing to do what it took. And I don't know if they're still doing it or not. It was Nolo, I don't know.
He's licensed.
Okay, yeah, so if you haven't gotten any complaints, because he took all the complaints very seriously and said he would address them, and he was pretty much willing to do whatever it took. But yeah, he had a big place. And nuisance calls were talked about and how that would be handled, and that's why we put in there that you had to have what number to call if you had a complaint, and hopefully the manager could be there. I can't remember what time frame we said he had to show up, but it was pretty quick, I think. And hopefully the manager could squelch anything that was going on, and if not, then call the police. But yeah.
That does, I'll use that as a segue into just the regulations. One thing we haven't talked about as a group is what they are. So I'm just gonna run through them. It sounds like most of you have read them, and we are on page 9 of the PowerPoint. So the notice of short-term rental applications must be sent to all property owners within 1,200 feet of the rental. I actually do not recommend that we have any notification of neighbor requirement for a permit of this nature, just like we don't require notification for any business license. And so when we're looking at a conditional use permit, that's when we definitely get a notice requirement with a conditional use permit, and so my thought is make a short-term rental use a conditional use in some districts if you want to require that they have that level of input from the property owners, but it should be equal and parallel to that conditional use process. It requires 2 parking spaces regardless of the occupancy of the short-term rental. Again, here, my recommendation would be that your short-term rental parking requirements mirror your occupancy parking requirements, that you see throughout your code and your districts. Authority of the planner to place reasonable conditions on the permit to ensure compliance with the general approval criteria of the short-term rental. I do not believe discretionary conditions on the permit are a good approach. I think that having very clear mandated requirements for conduct by these operations, whatever those might be, even if you go more stringent in order to do that, is a better approach with something like this. The maximum number of total permits right now is 75, and owners are limited to no more than 3 permits. Whenever we put a cap on something, we create a market. So whenever you say we are going to cap this at 75, then that means there's a 76th person who can't break into that market. And that creates a cost on the permits, and that changes conduct. What a person does to hold on to permit, because the permit has a value, what it does to the property impacted by the permit, and I know we're not there yet, but I worry. I worry that if we're going to create a market, we should do it intentionally. So I don't know where 75 permits comes from.
It was just
Odessa, okay, so it's one of those numbers, you know, if we're gonna have a number, let's have a number. Let's know the number, let's be the number. Like, let's show the community that we actually picked this number based on some saturation component, some resource, management component, some something, you know, and I think there are reasons, and so that's something we can explore and what those reasons are. And again, when I look at something like that, that's when I feel a bit overwhelmed and feel like, ooh, this would be a great topic for the comp plan. You know, when we start looking at regulations like that, then I think getting consultants and talking to people who have data that comes from an economist and not an attorney, you know, is really helpful to the bodies. The only.
I have a question.
Yes.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
So say we cap it at 75 and then somebody wants to come in, but, you know, is there a mechanism for, say if it's me and I decide, well, I don't want to do this anymore, can I sell it to Commissioner Seals like a liquor license? Or,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm being serious. I'm not trying to be funny. Because that's how it's done with liquor licenses.
Yeah.
I mean, or can I just say, look, I'm not doing this anymore, and then you know you got one more, and then you contact him, and he comes in and does his thing.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing here is their annual permits. So that is why then it resets, right?
Okay.
But then the person's gonna come in and get it. So even our provisions regarding transferability, I mean, we haven't created, because it's only a year, it's not like you've been permitted, so think about that. So let's say you've been running one for 15 years and you've gotten a permit. Every year you've shown up and got a permit. You've invested in this property, you've created a short-term rental. It's a good one, they have great reviews, they're not loud. And on the 16th year, you're number 76. Your business is done. You know, and that might be a real source of income for someone. Are you ready for that? Is that okay? Maybe that's okay. Maybe Wasilla says, you know what, we are fine with that. Because they should know our regulations, our provisions are clear. It's a 1-year permitting process with a total of 75. But if for 10 years, it hovers around 46 rentals, and then the Art of Games comes back and you've got, you know, and you're starting to get this influx and you're developing some small ecotourism, you know, pockets, which I mean, while I'm not from Wasilla, I have been here 15, 20 years ago, well, 20 years ago, and I've been here, you know, 35, 40 years ago when I was a kid, and it's changed a lot. There are a lot more pockets, right? There's a lot more happening here over that course of time, and so I don't know. That's the kind of stuff that I want you to think about. So maybe it's just going to a 5-year permit. Maybe it's going, but I think that annual permit needs to go. You know, I think, and there are a few people adopting it in the state now, and if I could, I'd give them the same advice. You know, is that's not a model that's going to work. It sounds good, but it's a lot of work, and it doesn't play out. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the other thing is, right now, only 1 of 2 units in a duplex may be a short-term rental. So I'm not sure if that's to preserve the long-term rental market or to ensure owner occupancy. And again, I do see communities that separate out how they regulate. A lot of them don't regulate owner-occupied short-term rentals at all, right? They subject it to a registration process. They do not regulate it. They regulate non-owner occupied. If it's non-owner occupied, we expect you to have a local manager. We want their number. If it's non-owner occupied, we expect you to limit guest to X number. A lot of them apply that to both, but usually there's, you'll find the non-owner occupied to have a sort of a laundry list of some basics we expect you to do. And to have all the short-term rentals subject to registration, insurance, and maximum guest number. And there's one more that a lot of them have, local manager. So those are the what, that's the structure. I like that structure. It feels really clear. And it lets you have that additional regulation, but you're not imposing those regulations on a person renting out a room in their home.
Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. With respect to the duplex, with renting only one side, I have a problem in that I believe that we should make that on a condition that the owner of the duplex own both sides, and then only one side would be available for a short-term rent. Other than that, somebody like myself could buy a duplex, not realizing that there's no covenant to it, only have somebody else buy the other one. Now I'm stuck with a short-term rental forever, and I get one vote to say, no, I don't like this at a planning commission. So I want to make that conditional.
Madam Mayor,
Mr. Crafton?
are you talking about like a condo unit? Because a duplex would be, when you buy a duplex, you own the whole building. There are ones in Anchorage that are what's a zero lot line, which we don't have out here as far as I recall, but it looks like a duplex, but it's technically two separate units. It's individual. Are you thinking about those? I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, there are units that have zero property lines, okay?
You know what he's talking, so basically.
It's a duplex.
Yeah.
One person owns one side, one person owns the other side with a common property.
Correct, that's classified something different. That was, like, we don't even call those a duplex. That's called a zero lot line, which they don't even exist outside of Anchorage, as far as I know. Just coming from the real estate aspect of it, like that, as far as
I've never
yeah.
came across one out here.
My daughter-in-law owned one in Anchorage. That's exactly why I was mentioning that. Okay.
I've never heard of one out here.
Well, I do think too, one of the things we can gather, I looked at a lot of HOA regulations just to see what are the standards in the HOA world, which comes up with the zero lot line. So we saw a lot of those. There's a lot in Anchorage especially that I found, and again, I'm just looking for an idea of what you can expect others to do when you're deciding your regulations. Most of them either outright prohibit them, which is what I saw more than anything, was outright prohibit them, or they impose very strict quiet hours, small maximum numbers, local manager. There is definitely, from the HOA perspective, this push to protect and the front end. And I don't know, Councilmember Crafton, are you seeing that in HOA documents in the real estate front?
Thank you, Mary.
Commissioner Stevens?
Honestly, there's not a lot of HOAs outside Anchorage as well. And that's actually was going to bring up a good point, was the newer neighborhoods we're seeing come up in the Matsu borough. It's a 50-50 toss-up whether we see something in there that prevents short-term rentals from happening, and usually they have some type of provision that says you can't rent for less than 6 months, which just outright prohibits them. But again, that only affects, honestly, new neighborhoods, because if you think about it, any neighborhood that's more than probably 10 or 15 years old predates short-term rentals as we know them today. So they're not going to have any provisions. And then a lot of times as well that I've seen, most neighborhoods in the valley are so old now that their covenants are non-existent, because a lot of times they put, I don't know if you'd call it a sunset clause in there, that basically if the residents of the neighborhood don't want these anymore, they expire after roughly 30 years. So we're starting to see more and more of these neighborhoods that even though when you buy the house, it has CCRs that you were given, they actually don't exist anymore. And honestly, the only way to enforce it is to take them to civil court. It's a civil lawsuit at that point, which is, I know the borough's addressing a lot of those concerns right now. It's a whole nother conversation, but I mean, to answer your question, no, I don't see it as often as you think we would.
And so that's really helpful too, especially knowing the expiring ones. So I mean, I own a condo in Anchorage that is from 1976, and I have a no, and so it just as a, but I have I can't rent to anyone for less than 6 months provision. So I think that is probably, that's a really good point, is that, you know, is it just the restriction on short-term rental? Are they gonna go so far as to limit, you know, the conduct, the way we see in a lot of the Anchorage CCRs and homeowner association provisions? So, I mean, whether or not that changes anything, I don't know, but that's one thing to note, is a lot of property managers are regulating that, but maybe they're not regulating that here as much, and so what does that mean? And maybe that impacts what districts ultimately that you want to allow it or you want to condition it. Or you want more general regulations, but we'll have to, so I'll bring well, actually, I'm gonna pause. Let's get through all of the regulations. I think that's a good thing to do. And then we'll talk about sort of where we ended up, which I think we ended up at a place where I'm bringing back 2 drafts of the short-term rental, not of the whole, to be clear. So, one that's registration heavy and one that's regulation light. And that's sort of, I think that's what I'm still hearing, but we'll see. And that'll be easy to add to on either front. So no more than 25% of a multifamily building may be used as a short-term rental. Maximum occupancy of the short-term is 2 persons per bedroom, plus 2 additional persons up to 10, excluding persons 2 years of age or under. The owner must ensure that short-term rental occupants, quote, do not create unreasonable noise or disturbances, engage in disorderly conduct, or violate applicable provisions of the Wasilla Municipal Code or in any state law pertaining to noise, disorderly conduct, overcrowding, the consumption of alcohol, or the use of illegal drugs. This is difficult, this one, for a lot of reasons. It would be great if we could hold the owner responsible and find that they violated this based on somebody doing illegal drugs and they're, you know, but that is a difficult thing to, 1, enforce and to hold a person to. I think that we certainly can hold the person who's doing those things accountable, right? And that person will be arrested and will be subject to the laws of the state of Alaska and the city of Wasilla, and there'll be consequences for each of those things. If we're talking about the consumption of alcohol, you really have to think about that. So are we saying in the city of Wasilla that you're not allowed to drink in an Airbnb, but you're allowed to drink in the house next to it? So, I mean, I just make sure that's what you want to say, because what this in essence is saying is that we have made it unlawful for you to have a glass of wine in a short-term rental.
I don't think that's what this says.
It is what it says
I
in
think it
part.
says, or violate applicable provision of the Wasilla Municipal Code regarding the consumption of alcohol.
Yes, but it says that, so what it says, there's no disorderly conduct as well. And it says pertaining to noise, disorderly conduct, overcrowding, the consumption of alcohol, or the use of illegal drugs. So for when I read this, I see us saying that any law pertaining to disorderly conduct or any of this litany of things, you're prohibited from, you need to ensure that your rental guests don't do any of these things, including unreasonable noise or disturbances, and again, disorderly conduct, and then you have your laundry list. So this could be interpreted to be telling them that they need to control their premises from all of these things, including, right, and we don't define these things. So under our laws, we define nuisance, and we define nuisance fairly loosely because, but we have a process that we use to enforce violations of the nuisance provisions, right? And so that's important. We need that. Nuisance provisions are common. There's a lot of case precedent on them, but we have created another violation, another realm of misconduct that we don't have the same provisions on, we don't have the same process to enforce. So if we want to say you must ensure that your occupants comply with the law, we can say that, but again, also difficult, right? Because it's very difficult to make sure everybody complies with the law, even if you're renting them a facility. What we can do is make sure that they have insurance and indemnification. We can make sure that, and we can do something where you require quiet hours, but then I think we're stepping into that next realm of regulation. So let's just make sure, I mean, we can do quiet hours on it more in a different way, and I think we'll research that. I want to come back to that because I want to make sure I know how to do that in the best way possible. Which is different than a curfew, right? You're just trying to, so I want to look at that. But this particular provision, again, I think that the point is clear. What we're trying to do is control the rowdy night after night party on, in a location. But then the question becomes, does this provision do that, or does it, does it go too far? And if we could just hold them liable for a nuisance, which we can do with or without this, can't we get to the same place when they allow that kind of conduct on their property?
Mr. Johnson?
Madam Mayor and Councilor, wouldn't it be just better to just simply say failure of the owner to ensure that disorderly conduct or violation of the laws will result in the revocation of the permit for short-term rental and leave it at that? Now you put the owner back on the onus back on the owner, plus you take the elimination of the enforcement from code enforcement, basically, because if they get turned in by the police, we're done,
Yeah, no, I think you can, and I think we
Make
just,
it a lot simpler.
Madam Mayor.
yeah.
Mr. Crafton?
Thank you. I get where the idea is behind the rule, what Mr. Johnson's saying. But at the end of the day, if I rent to Mr. Graham,
You're Joe.
right, I know, already we're at the problem. I mean, am I gonna sit down the street and make sure he's, not doing drugs there? Like, that's basically what this is saying. Like, at part of it is saying, you understand that you're renting this under a reasonable thing. To an extent, I shouldn't be held liable if he chooses to do that. That's a hard balance where it says, like, I just have a hard time. I'm with saying, if somebody else comes into my house and breaks the law, am I the one liable for them breaking the law? They're their own adult, they're their own person. That's partly why we have an age limitation here. That's what I think about with this one, is you start getting into that, like, I'm being punished because you chose to do something wrong, but I don't have any control over your actions. I mean, I think it's just one of those given things, like, duh, you shouldn't be doing illegal things. Like, come on. I think we know that.
It's true, and you think, well, is a hotel liable when somebody does drugs in the hotel room? And would Wasilla be comfortable holding all hotel owners liable for what happens in the rooms?
You can.
And would you have any hotels if you did? So, I mean.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I've run hotels before and had to deal with those exact issues. No, the hotels are not liable for it. But, everything that we have in here about alcohol and, whether it's alcohol, drugs, it's noise, the city already has a noise ordinance in place, if I remember right. I think it's 10 o'clock is when you're
I think
supposed
it's
to.
quiet time is 10 o'clock.
Yeah, is,
Have one.
Are you sure?
Yeah, we discussed it.
because I know, basically my back door is Snyder Park. That's owned by the Pioneers of Alaska, so it's a privately owned park. They rent it out to groups, well, by donation because they're a nonprofit. And groups, real estate groups have it, they have big bounce houses, they have bands, they have all kinds of stuff. It is shut off at 10 o'clock every night. And your music in the park has to be I've always been under the understanding that there was a noise ordinance for a quiet time for 10, like, I think it's 10 to 7 a.m., something like that, which is real common in most communities.
That's just in parks.
Like
Is
public,
that just in
public
just in
zoning.
public parks?
Yeah.
I think it's a permit. I think it's specified in the permit, not in the code.
In the permits, okay. But, anything else, as far as there being lots of noise, underage drinking and stuff, that's already covered by law. And if somebody calls, the police or anything else, they're gonna pay the price for it. I don't know that we need to duplicate all of that in here. I think it's already covered by state law, the drinking age and illegal drugs and things like that. And and please bear with me a second, because I want to back up to one thing where you have in our current regulations, the 2 parking spaces regardless of occupancy of short-term rental. Our code has, for short-term rentals, it's got a minimum of on-site 2 parking spaces. But when the unit consists of more than 4 bedrooms, each additional bedroom and sleeping area beyond the first 4 requires an additional dedicated parking space. So we do have, for these bigger VRBOs and things like that, we do have it in our code currently that they would have to have more parking spaces. So I just, I thought, well, maybe I was missing something when I saw that it says 2 regardless of occupancy. Was I missing something?
Jamie,
I think just 1220 limitation of motorized uses on Wasilla Lake and Lake Lucille, that's the 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. So that's maybe where that's coming from.
Thank you.
And that's very useful, actually, because then if we're regulating, it raises the question, it's really helpful, because it raises that question, how do we use public space, public property, riparian rights, our waterways, can we use regulations there to get to where Councilmember Crofton and Eric were talking about, that sort of community regulation. So, and that's something that we'll make a note as we bring that ordinances forward, or these provision, these 2 options. We'll make sure that we make it clear where those protections are, time periods anyway.
Madam Mayor,
Mr. Seals.
thank you. A lot of these Airbnbs and bed and breakfasts, they self-regulate. So if you mess up, you may not be able to rent from Airbnb, period. So there's a lot of self-regulation in these Airbnbs and certain groups that the short-term rentals go to for their advertising and marketing, that if you mess up, you're out. You don't get to it again. So why do we add a layer when they're self-regulating themselves?
When you rent a VRBO, there is you evaluate the place you rent, and then the person that rents it to you evaluates you. How well did you leave it? And, it's a 2-way street. And people look, when you're trying to rent another one, people look at that. Let's see how well, did you tear up whatever, but they look at that. So to me, a lot of this short-term rental, it's like a hotel. If you've got 2-bedroom, you can have 2 adults per bedroom and a little kid, whatever. But a hotel won't let you have 12 people in one room, no matter what you want. No. And so short-term rentals are the same way. They will self-regulate. And as far as the noise and all that stuff, it's like Ian said, am I gonna sit on the front porch and with my ear to the door to see what's going on in there? You can't do that. So you can't enforce number 8. as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how you could.
Yeah, I think it really comes to the enforcement and what that really looks like when you're holding a property owner liable for somebody else's violations of law. And then if it's not violations of law, then we're talking about violations of conduct. And that's where we get to that very blurred line of what is disorderly conduct for purposes of short-term rentals, right? We have definitions for disorderly conduct for purposes of laws, but this is not just laws. This goes beyond that, because they don't want to see unreasonable noise or disturbances or engage in disorderly conduct. And then you get your reference to the laws. And so by separating it out, then what it says to me potentially is that, yeah, there's all those laws that you can violate, but then there's this nebulous new thing, which is what we consider disorderly conduct. Because if it was a law, or it was even a code provision, it's included in the second part. And so in a court, when a court interprets language, it interprets language to have meaning. So if you use disorderly conduct twice in the same sentence, that means it means two different things, or it means the same things and is referring back to itself, which this isn't, because it refers to disorderly conduct under the code and disorderly conduct and improper behavior. So anyway, now I'm rambling, but I will say, this is not my favorite provision. Okay, so, and that we can do what you want to do here in a better way. At the very least, we can clean that up. All right, the rental agreement must require renters to be 21 years old or older, obtain the name, address, and driver's license or passport number of the renter, and must have provisions that identify trash collection days and regulations regarding trash on the premises. I feel like the trash is probably overkill. I don't see that in a lot of places. If they litter, you can fine them. And if they litter, so can the state. And we actually have a lot of really robust provisions to protect our environment. If someone leaves their trash out, there could be provisions that govern that. And I think there probably are above and beyond even the short-term rental. But again, creating more and more regulation just within this realm, it makes me a little bit nervous. I don't like the 21 years old or older. If someone, you have an 18-year-old we live in a state that has a right to privacy under our Constitution, which means they protected a middle school child's right to have long hair in the state, and found that the school district's attempt to force him to cut his hair, and this was in the 1970s, was a violation of his constitutional right to privacy. So for me, whenever I think about government action and youth, I channel that case. And I think it was brought up by his father on behalf of the child, but I think about that. We are restricting someone's, as a government, we are restricting a 21-year-old's right to rent a piece of, to rent an Airbnb. And we wouldn't have been permitted to tell him how to cut his hair, or her how to cut their hair, and so do we have a problem? I'm going to say no. I do not think we have a problem. I think we have a reasonable basis for the adoption of our short-term rental provisions, and they are wholly lawful. That said, it's an interesting thought, and so I don't love the 21 years old, so.
Mr. Gray.
Thank you. And one of the points that Mr. Johnson brought up and Ms. Cowell brought up was business insurance and liability insurance. So this 21-year-old thing sounded like a good idea when it was put in, but if we're going to require them to have insurance, the insurance company is going to be the one that makes that decision for them. So I don't, I agree with you for once. That's probably not needed. So.
Feel of his head, Jane.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Seals.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, here's a scenario you might want to look at, and I'm on your side in this. We already have laws for alcohol. Here's a young soldier that's getting ready to be deployed, has a crappy apartment, but wants to rent an Airbnb to propose to his wife before he leaves. At 18 years old, we're sending him off to fight and die for our country. I think that young man has the right to rent an Airbnb.
Kathy.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I feel like that the 21-year-old rule there, that should be, in my opinion, up to the discretion of the property owner. Whether they want to rent to somebody under 21, whether they want to assume any liability, and whether their insurance would allow that. But, I mean, I understand what you're saying. My grandson in the Marines turned 21 in a foreign country that couldn't drink at all. So, and his buddies wanted to take him out. They wanted to rent a place in California before he was shipped overseas. And the owner of the place said no. It wasn't in their code where he wasn't. The owner said no, and that was their choice. So they just waited till he came back from overseas and was 23 and threw a party for him. But I mean, I agree. That's a whole different, argument with those that, they can die for our country, but they can't drink. But I think when it comes to our codes and things, I think that's something that should be left up to the property owner.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Crafton?
Weirdly enough, the only part of this I somewhat like is the trash collection day. And the reason why is, and I mean, again, should we really regulate it? No, but just to give some background behind why is, I've stayed at a couple Airbnbs, VRBO, short-term rentals, I guess really what we're calling them. And they have in their rules, they'll put that in there. If it's X day, when you're renting from me, would you please put the trash can at the end of the driveway for us? And that's specifically so that their trash is getting picked up. So, I mean, do we need to regulate that line in there? Probably not, but I mean, I understand why that portion of it was added. Everything else, again, why can you die for our country, not consume alcohol? Whole nother argument. And but there's some reasoning behind like that one being there. It does help with keeping so we don't drive by a short-term rental and trash cans overflowing. I get why that's there.
And that begs the question too, is there a way in the licensing procedure and the registration provisions where we can make sure that they're following, just like other businesses, that there is, we expect you to take care of the garbage generated from the business. So is there a way to put it in just the very basic X, Y, and Z provisions? I think it'll be hard. I think it'll stick out, but we'll see what it looks like if there's a way. I think one of the other things is, one thing I need to understand more, and maybe I don't know if the bodies do too, but my question would be, so who are our trash collectors? What does trash collection really look like in Wasilla? And is there a difference between, are there regulations being imposed by the companies that collect the trash? A lot of people just deliver their trash themselves to the facility? I don't know. I should know more about it, but I don't know that much about it. So I will learn more about it, and that we'll incorporate that into.
Well, Holly,
those
wouldn't that be
provisions.
covered in the rental agreement?
Oh yeah, all of these things. I mean, I don't know. I would be very surprised if someone wants to rent their Airbnb to anybody under the age of 25, much like nobody is going to rent their car to anybody under the age of 25. And that's unfortunate for them and for a bunch of reasons, but we are a government. So when we tell them they can't do it, we are prohibiting it by law, and that is a different thing. So not to take issue with any of these provisions, I would be fine. I mean, I would expect an agreement to have potentially have in the house rules exactly what you're supposed to do with the garbage and how you're supposed to deal with it. And if you're in a rental where they say, don't worry about it, we pick it up, fine, but I would expect to see that. And I think they need to have that, otherwise their home is not going to be able to, or you're not gonna have a very highly rated short-term rental, I would imagine.
Eric?
So we have a whole section under Section 8 about refuse, garbage collection and disposal. And so we're talking about now these overlaps and just general neighborliness, and I think you talk about enforcement, so code compliance will respond to a commercial business that's got a huge dumpster, but they don't have it picked up often enough, right? You've got the receptacle, you've got the structure you built around it, everything's flowing out. Call them twice a week, not once a week. It's easy to do those housekeeping things that need to happen. But I think as the bodies discuss, there's already a lot of provisions in the existing code that has enforceability that probably doesn't need to be duplicated, because duplication creates errors and then you can't figure out which one was first. And so anyway, I think the code has a lot of stuff that probably doesn't need to be duplicated in whatever the action of the body is in the future.
So based on that too, that I think one thing I'll do is I'll work with the administration just to identify the duplication and make sure you have the references and citations to where those protections might already exist in the code. And so we feel comfortable excluding them or at least mirroring them, right? We want to, but that idea that you come in for a license and you're subjecting yourself to some governance based on your commercial operations within the city of Wasilla. So it does carry with it expectations and regulations. So I also am not a huge fan of no weddings, meetings, luncheons, reunions, bachelor or bachelorette parties, receptions, fundraising events, commercial or advertising activities, or gatherings.
Regulation.
Of unauthorized lodgers may occur in a short-term rental. So that's, I mean.
You're no fun lawyer.
All they want you to do is sleep and take a shower.
Get out.
And get out. Take your trash with you. Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think when these regulations were initially brought on board, the Planning Commission and the City Council had this big pie in the sky idea to be helpful to property owners. And I think we've exceeded the scope of government by doing that. I'm the government, I'm here to help. That never works. You know, so since there wasn't a lot of guidance out there on what to do, I think the Planning Commission and the council said, well, we'll just tell you you can't do this. But now there's plenty of reasons for anybody that wants to be a potential short-term rental operator. There's plenty of guidance out there. They can go to any lawyer in town, or even in Anchorage for that matter, and find rental contracts that will steer them in the right direction. So I don't think the government needs, the city of Wasilla government needs to be in the business of helping people write contracts for VRBOs, so.
And this one, I mean, that's really helpful because I do think when Councilmember Vilek said we were listening to concerns and then we were addressing them one by one. I mean, that to me, that was the one when you said that, I was like, oh, that's where we get our luncheons and our meetings and our bachelorette parties and our stuff. Each one of these had, it had been and I get it, especially the bachelor and bachelorette parties, but, so. But I think the luncheons, meetings, reunions, receptions, these can look, I feel like, very different thing depending on how you're throwing it. In a luncheon, I mean, I'm not sure about that one. I'm like, are they not allowed to eat lunch on the property? They're supposed to meet me on the porch.
Thank you, Mayor. I mean, I can understand where why we could say this. Like, there is some logic behind that. I mean, I live on a half-acre property. Couldn't imagine having a wedding in my backyard. Like, I mean, there's not a lot of privacy there. But for like some of the ones that Eric, I pulled up the Airbnbs too when we were chatting there, and I mean, I saw some 8-bedroom house on Lake Lucille, as a matter of fact. So that I mean, like, that property is that destination property where that's what they're looking for. They're looking for something like that. And so that's where this should lean on the rental agreement. If the property owner should have the right to restrict this or allow it as needed. I think this rule also goes back to that good neighbor thing where it just says, hey, if you guys are going to do this, at 10 o'clock, you should probably tone it down, whatever the time frame might be. I think that's more so where we should be protecting our neighborhoods, saying, hey, we want everybody to be respectful, but why are we telling them you can't? I mean, I want my bachelor party, like, come on.
No, I think that's a good point. I think also this is why we get back to redundancies, you know, do we maybe just need a special event permit process, or we make sure that we incorporate this, a special, you know, so that a wedding becomes a wedding subject to a special event permit if it's over a certain amount of people, and it has, because this is a commercial operation, they're getting paid to use the facility, and so we just frame that in a way where we're getting those protections, but we're not accidentally protecting the 3-person wedding that happens in a, you know, because a wedding only, I mean, I think it can happen with 2 people, so, you know, you've got, you know, and so, you know, we're restricting a wedding, but that's, you know, again, a wedding can be 500 people, or it could be 2, and same thing, luncheon, again, we could use definitions to define these, but I won't spend any more time on this one, which just gives you an idea. Okay. Other restrictions, so no yurts, RVs, travel trailers, tents, or other temporary shelters be used for short-term rentals. That may be a rule that the council and commission want, but I will say, I think in Alaska, one of the sort of booming short-term rental businesses are yurts and RVs and campground sites, campsites. So, and therefore those spaces would generate revenue. So it's just something to do. If you're going to do it intentionally. A short-term rental permit is issued for 1 year. You all know my feelings on that. The property owner must be a resident of the state of Alaska. That's a big decision. So the question is, are other commercial enterprises, are the owners of those business, must they be residents of the state of Alaska? So this is one of those things. If you're going to make this the rule, make sure you want that to be the rule, and then we need to do a little bit of research to make sure that that does not violate several different constitutional provisions that protect individuals from discrimination when it comes to resident versus non-resident. I think we'd be protected. I think the city of Wasilla has a lawful provision because we have reasons. But we need to be clear about what those reasons are. And we're talking about the property owner. We're not talking about the local manager, right? So I think it's much, for me, I understand why we need someone on boots on the ground to respond to that property and maintain it and take care of it and be accountable for it. The question is, does the person who owned the property have to be a resident of Alaska? What about all of those individuals who are residents of Alaska? And then the winters get a little hard. And so they maintain their property and they move to Florida and they come up a couple months in the summer and they're very much still active members of the Wasilla community, but they do it in a different way because we live in a somewhat hard place, you know? So, I mean, that's the scenario to consider when you're thinking about this regulation.
Could you say property owner or property manager must be a resident of the state?
Madam Mayor, isn't the legislature currently grappling with the question of what is a resident? I believe I saw that headline recently. So it sounds like the state doesn't even know what a resident is. I don't know that we could do better than what they're doing right now. Maybe we could, I don't know.
Well,
We have deferred. Madam Mayor, what I was saying, we just defer to the state. That's actually what it says. We claim somebody a resident, whatever the state says it is. I actually brought this up when I was on the planning commission, this specific question. I think we had started discussing it because what I think about when you talk about a resident is you think of somebody as well that lives here for a long time. They build a business, however it might be, and maybe a part of that business is owning a short-term rental or multiple of them, or multiple rental properties is something that gets, the dream life is owning multiple rental properties. It pays for your life and you go live somewhere else. Basically what we're saying is that the moment you decide you don't want to live in Alaska anymore, which it gets hard when you get older, you now have to give up your short-term rental in the city of Wasilla. We are saying you have to shut down your business, which it goes back to that whole 1 year thing as well. Like, to me, that is really restrictive. I get where it's going, and I think what we should be looking at, like you're saying, Mayor, with having somebody, a resident, I think a local contact, somebody that can, and I think there's a line in there that the way the local contact states is it needs to be somebody that can respond to the property. I want to say it's within 24 hours. Like they have to be able to be physically present within a certain amount of time. And a lot of people do have somebody nearby a lot of times, which I think that's more so the answer, is just saying, hey, we just need somebody nearby to be able to handle this. Thank you.
I really like the local manager, like the somebody who can respond to the property. You know, I think that that's in the original code, and I thought it was well written and very useful. Because of that reason, and because of the residency, I mean, I think there is a not uncommon model for Alaskans to leave, rent out a property that used to be a long-term residence, right, as an Airbnb or a short-term rental, and then not rent it out when they come and stay for at least a portion of the summer, and they actually use that in a way to be able to sustain that lifestyle. So as a lawyer, I don't care if you allow them to do that or not, in theory, but I don't want to see restrictions based on residency unless we really understand and explain and detail why, so that we are staying on the right side of the law.
Madam Mayor.
Melvin?
Yeah, so I have a question. So, and I'm just thinking, you know, somebody wanting to litigate this. Is this a requirement for somebody that has long-term rentals, that they have to be residents? And what do you do if an entity like a corporation or LLC wants to, are they gonna be required to be, you know, based in Alaska, or at least, you know, have their business here?
No, these are all good questions. I mean, generally, when we see a residency requirement for Wasilla or otherwise that's imposed, there's a benefit that somebody is getting and a short-term provision regarding residency, right? So you see it with our PFD. You saw it with a lot of the CARES Act, right? We saw a lot of the grants that we were considering. We did look at residency for businesses or otherwise, making sure the purpose was for the recovery and aid to Wasilla and to providing services to people in Wasilla, you know, so those ties to residency were very comfortable for me from a legal perspective, right? Because I can explain, I'm not saying these aren't, I think this is lawful. I think we just need to, you know, we have to answer all of those questions, and we need to answer them in a way that says the reason why we here in Wasilla only allow property rentals, short-term rentals to property or Alaska residents are or is, and then we give them, and we are firm and we understand them, and we are all, you know, we're all very supportive of these reasons. And I'm not, you know, I don't know what those reasons are, so we want to make sure that we define them. So even if we keep the code as is, for example, before we maintain this provision, I am going to be asking the bodies to give me the reasons why, so we can memorialize those and protect the city. And that's it, and we're gonna pull it all together. So how we do? Well, good thing we separated this out on its own. You know? No, I don't know if anybody wants to give us, what I'm hearing is those two options is a good approach. I think what that means is when I bring the final draft, I will pick which one I like better and put it in that draft, and I will have an excerpt of the one I don't like as much, but is definitely within your purview to choose. And then we will decide which one to work on. And there may be, I think that's the only one, so that'll make it easier, where I'm gonna have an excerpt. You know what I mean? Where it will be, where it will be different. Are there any further questions or? So.
I do, Holly, and maybe now is not the time. Do you see the drafts again being joint meetings?
I don't know, I think that's probably a good question.
To talk, we can talk.
Yeah, so there may be, I mean, I think one thing that might be, I mean, I think our choices are, we have another meeting where everybody has the draft, or we take that draft, because I think we do have, and we start doing the traditional track of a Title 16 consideration, meaning going to the Planning Commission, talking about those things, working through it, which might mean that the Planning Commission has a heavy workload, has some extra work sessions, depending on what comes out of that. I feel like it'll be a lot less than it would have been, because we have now walked through all of it together. And maybe that, actually, as I say that out loud, does that work better with the budget work sessions? If the Planning Commission is focused on Title 16, the first draft, and then it comes.
I think I just defer to the body or see what other people think.
Yeah. I mean, what are the thoughts?
This
Or
is
the
an
other
all-new
option is just to
territory.
keep going. Yeah, we can keep going this way too. We can keep meeting. I just feel like, I know it's a lot, so.
Mr. Graham?
I think at some point this needs to be diverted into the traditional streams. However, at this point, when you're talking about bringing back drafts, I think this is the proper way to do that. And then after we kind of, I won't say agree on a draft, but beat up the draft a little bit, then it can go to the Planning Commission for their specific concerns, and then it would be referred to the City Council, for approval, amendment, however that works. But I do think at least one more of these joint meetings is appropriate.
Okay, so we'll do a segment 5 that we bring, because I like that too. I mean, then when you say that, I'm like, well, we don't have a decision on short-term rentals yet. So even for that reason, getting it so that there is no excerpt together would be useful. I think there's also that piece, I think, Crystal, you guys are looking at an RFP for the comp plan, right? Can you talk about that a little bit, just for the timing piece? I want to just see how.
Yeah, so for the comp plan, our goal is to have that RFP out by May. And because we want the highest level of stakeholder engagement, it's best to do it in the fall when people are inside and they're willing to come inside. And so that comp plan would start in September, and that would go for up to a year. Yeah.
Okay, so that tells me, one thing I think I would like to do is get the Title 16 meeting scheduled before the RFP goes out, so anyone responding to the RFP has an idea of this project, so it's always on their radar, when they're going through the comp plan. But the one thing I would also ask, and I have a tendency to want to give a deadline for when I'm going to get this product done. This is actually, this last piece, I want to get it clean. I want to get everything in there. I want to make sure I deal with comments. A lot of the council members' comments and commissioners' comments will be in the silent. So I'm not going to give you a day for a work session yet. I will coordinate with the clerk's office and get that on the books as soon as I am a little bit, where I've gotten closer and feel like I can give a solid date. I'm not rushing to do anything in order to catch up to that date.
So I want to propose to the body. So previously I sent out an email and I said, we're thinking of these meetings. Do these dates work? Please confirm. Are there any dates that don't work for certain members? Or do I have permission to just schedule segment 5 with the attorney? Or how does the bodies, what works?
I know for me, Wednesdays are particularly challenging because of relationships I have with other nonprofit boards. And for some reason, they like to meet on Wednesdays. And they meet once a month as opposed to us meeting, once a week, it seems like. And so Wednesdays for me are just a particularly challenging day. So.
Madam Mayor? Quick question. We're not looking at within the next 2 weeks, right?
No, and I am out of the state from March 8th to March 18th.
Perfect. Okay.
And so we'll not be working on this I will not be
And
working
then-
on this. I'm
The one day I
keep
had in
telling
mind.
myself that.
What was that? My thought on this is if we're gonna look at this the entirety of what we've taken 5 2-hour times to do, it's gonna be a lot of work in one. I personally think 2 of them might be better unless we said like, we're gonna do this at Saturday at 10 a.m. and we're gonna have another lengthy, just know going into it that it's gonna be a longer meeting. Because if we're gonna hopefully it shouldn't take that long, because again, we're just trying to get an overview and then again, make a couple decisions and then spread it back out to the planning commission. I'd hope that the meeting doesn't take that long. We've already gone over it for 10 hours now, plus hours, so I would hope that we wouldn't have to. My thought would be, again, just in case we're prepared and we're not here till 10 o'clock at night, a Saturday might be beneficial for people. That's my thought on it.
I have hourly staff, I think, not everyone's salary. I just feel like for staff giving up a Saturday, or even for those that work, that are on the commission, I know this would be at least the 3rd Saturday session that I'm aware of. And really leading up to this, what about if we had a 5 o'clock start time to give us an extra hour? Councilmember Rubio?
Yes, thank you. Saturdays are really too rough for me. And then I can wiggle a Wednesday at 5 if I can prepare for it.
So we could so we're not gonna do Wednesdays, actually, Wednesdays is a tough day, we're gonna try to not do Wednesdays, and to give us extra time, could everybody else, does a 5 o'clock start work? And we'll see, Councilmember Crafton, if we can't get through it, and then if need be, we will schedule another meeting if that's okay. I'll check with all of you.
Madam Mayor, sorry, I just want to add, the last week of March, so the week of the 25th, not a good week for me either. I know we got a meeting on that week already, but it'd be best if my wife's having surgery,
The
so.
first week of April, we have a conference.
I am not getting this to you by the first week of April, so
Okay,
that'll be,
perfect.
I mean,
Good to know. That's good to know, there we go.
I would love to. Mayor, that sounded very forceful. I'm working on my boundaries, okay? Could you tell? No,
I'm just saying, we have a conference. First week of April, we'll be gone.
No, I'm
Crystal and I
hoping,
will.
there's just some pieces of the formatting and finalizing. I want this to be clean, and it's 150 pages, so clean 150 pages, and there's pieces I'm moving. I know it's gonna take me a little bit longer than I would even want it to, but I'm going to work diligently and regularly and consistently on it, but I know it's gonna need to be clean. And the other pieces, once I give it to council, or once we put it in a packet, the big question is, it's not going to be a small document. It's a lot to read. Even just to read it is gonna take council and commissioners time. But maybe, there's 2 ways to attach that. Either we give time, so that draft goes out to the bodies and there's time given, or we accept that you're not going to take time and we talk about it together and we go through the substantive provisions and we provide a memo. But I feel like for some of you, digging in and reading it yourself is how you take ownership. That's where you find the pieces that really matter to you. So I guess there's just these decisions, and I don't know, Jamie, what do you recommend
To
for
clarify,
solving?
you wanted you wanted a final draft before we went out to RFP, or you wanted it adopted?
Oh, no, final draft. I want a draft that, so if I were responding to an RFP, I would say, hey, look at this, they're working on their Title 16, and here's the draft that they're working on. They haven't introduced it yet, but look at, I'm so worried that we will do work that will presume that the comp plan is picking up a piece that the comp plan doesn't pick up, or that we don't flag for the, you know what I mean? Because so much of this, we're stepping back regulation, but it's important that in some ways, some of that regulation.
So I think we're gonna do sounds like we're gonna do a May meeting. We're gonna shoot for 5 o'clock, and it's not gonna be on a Saturday or a Wednesday. Does that work?
Sounds good.
Okay, so far?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, and we always
Thank
do,
you. That was
for
very
packets,
succinct.
remember, we
That
always
was
do
too
5
fast.
days prior.
One comment I was going to make is with the RFP, we're flexible on getting that out. This first step of getting the draft so that the proposers can see it. We were just chatting about the fall timeline for getting public comments. You know, there's a lot of space in there, and we want to make sure it's well advertised. So this is really important. There's no reason to rush it for the RFP for the comp plan. They do need to go back to back. So with the planning that you've been doing for scheduling, it sounds great, but we don't need to short circuit this process because of the May desire to get the RFP out. That's all I'm trying to say.
Well, then that's perfect. We will get it done. We will get it done diligently and quickly, but not in the next 2 weeks. And then we will, so, and then I will work with the administration to make sure that, you know, you have, but you could, because that will allow you to incorporate it a bit into the RFP, right? Or at least make sure that's part of the, so. Okay, so we've tackled.
So we will have a read ahead of the draft before we come back. As much as I would love to read over 150 pages.
Yeah, and you know, one thing we can consider too, and I don't mean to complicate things, but once we get that draft in front of you all we may want to talk about splitting it up too. Like at that point, when we have a discussion and some people delve into it, we may also say, hey, let's split up portions of this into working groups, you know, for discussions, or that will be primarily responsible for bringing back comments on that piece, or, you know, and I don't know, you know, so we've had working groups that move a legislation forward before. Title 16 is one of the largest titles in the code, you know, so, and we've moved forward chapters. We've had working groups for chapters. So to the extent we create a working group for short-term rentals and a working group for landscaping, you know, and then at the next meeting, and then that allows me to work with both and pull in comments. So that's something, but
We'll see.
hopefully we don't need that.
We'll see, because then it gets into appointment and then an AM and, but the one thing really that I'm very optimistic about, me sitting here, the really only sticky point or little differing of opinions is short-term rentals. So
Which
maybe
is
I'm
true.
just super optimistic tonight.
Well, and everybody's done a lot of work too, so I'm being overly cautious because I don't want there to be an avenue that we end up going down that I did not, that you did not anticipate. But we've had 10 hours, 5 segments of incredibly collaborative work, and so I do think,
And I guess,
who knows,
Holly,
maybe
if-
we're just.
yeah, if I may, if there is something that absolutely you think is gonna be a sticking point, don't, email Holly. You know, CC me if you think something is just you just can't work through, or you need more information, or something that will help in the draft so that we're just a little bit more productive.
Yes, and that would be really helpful, and if there's anything that is still hanging out there that we haven't talked about, and Councilmember Crafton raised just snow removal issues, so that's, you know, and also sent comments and questions to be incorporated into and I love that, like that, because when I have it in writing like that, I also can turn it into a checklist. So I really, any and all comments that you guys want to send, and just copy the clerk and send them our way, that would be great. And one of the things I need to make sure I give this to the administration too before I bring it back, because if we miss, there's a wealth of knowledge on the administration side because they administer the code, right? So I need to build time into that and make sure that you guys have real time too, so.
Madam Mayor, this might be a good segue, like she was asking. May I?
Sure.
Try and keep it short. One of the things I brought up with Holly that I realized we didn't discuss, and I brought this up with Eric, was snow storage and snow removal. One of the conversations that we've had is parking lots and actually considering allowing for smaller parking lots. And Eric and I discovered, I think it was chapter 12 was where we currently have code for whenever you build a parking lot, it has to actually be adequate size to store your snow. So if we're considering giving them the option to shrink it, then we also have to say, hey, you need a place to store your snow. It almost contradicts itself in a sense, I feel. So I had asked Holly to look into it to see where, how we would adjust this and keep that in mind, because, well, snow storage is a concern for us here. I mean, we've seen 2 years in a row now within higher than average, I believe, snowfall. And I mean, there's a lot of other concerns I have around how snow is right now, but just for the sake of conversation right now, I mean, unless there's objection, I would ask that Holly bring us forth that consideration in the draft, as well as incorporating something around the snow storage, which might just be moving that one reference into I think it was landscape was what we talked about.
Mr. Graham.
Madam Mayor, I move to exit committee of the whole.
Madam Mayor, I second.
Rubio second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Graham and seconded by Councilmember Rubio to exit committee of the whole. Is there objection to the motion? Hearing none, we are now out of committee of the whole. The time is 8:30 p.m. There's no new business this evening. Audience comments. There's no one in the audience for a comment, so we'll bring it to the dais. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just great meeting, great work, you guys. It's nice to all be together, and we'll see City Council here on Monday for our very short regular meeting.
I think that's what she said today.
You already jinxed us. Madam Attorney.
No comment, Madam Mayor, thank you.
Councilmember Rubio.
Even though I didn't get to see everybody's faces, I missed you, but great job tonight. Way to keep it short. And I will see you guys not on Monday, but I will be on the phone Monday.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilmember Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thanks everybody for great input there. I'm just going to bring forward a couple of things for your consideration and all of our consideration. Number one, as part of the packet today, there was this handout from Anchorage, and I know we don't want to model ourselves after the way the Anchorage Assembly does business, but the Anchorage Assembly is a very professional body in that they have staff, they are full-time people, they have a tremendous amount of resources available to them. And in my previous life working for MTA, I used to go to their meetings, you know, which sometimes were 7, 8 hours long on a Tuesday night, nothing but fun. But I mean, they really dug into things from a wide variety of different things. So if you haven't already reviewed this packet, you know, that's assembly member short-term rentals. If you haven't had a chance to take a look through that, please do that, because like I said, we've already got the basic shape of the wheel. We're just trying to make sure that it's round and it's the appropriate size. So please take time and look through that, because they spend a lot of time and a lot of resources looking through that, so we don't have to. Second thing, we haven't talked, we talked a little bit about capacity, maximum capacity of short-term rentals and so on and so forth. I think one of the things that we need to consider here in our city is the capacity of the sewage systems associated with those rentals. It does no good to put people, you know, 10 people in a house that has a 2-bedroom sewage system in it. It does no good to, you know, to overtax our already overtaxed system. So it's just something that we need to be aware of, whether Public Works might come up with some sort of recommendation or something. I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly know that we don't want to end up with, you know, 10 of these party rentals on the same leg of our sewer system, because that would be a problem. It looks like Eric has a comment on that.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think whatever the provision that comes out of this is, there should be some review, right? What we look at with changes in use is that new use acceptable? And so if the house was designed with a certain size tank, and then they're proposing a change of use and making more bedrooms, making a bonus room a bedroom, we would want to say, that tank doesn't meet our standards anymore. So having that opportunity and whatever the permitting process looks like is important, because there will be that pressure by businesses or rental owners to maximize revenue by maximizing the amount they can charge with more people, that sort of thing. So we're always looking for opportunities to make sure that we're not risking our infrastructure with a change of use.
And I'm glad to hear that. And like I say, I'm not sure that that belongs in the regulations itself, but it certainly is something that needs to be looked at. And in the back of our mind, we spend a lot of time and energy keeping our sewage system running, and we definitely don't want to set ourselves up for failure there. The last thing I wanted to bring up was the concept of light industrial. We haven't really talked about that. I think we're at a size now in the city where we need to talk about light industrial. Where do we store mechanical equipment? Where do we store vehicles? Where do we store materials? And that sort of stuff. They don't need to be in what we consider to be in a heavy industrial district, hidden away someplace and so on and so forth. But I mean, look at all the construction around us. I mean, we live off of a lot of the construction projects that happen here, and what do they do with their equipment in the wintertime when it's not being used? I mean, currently there really isn't any place to store that equipment in the city, and if there were some light industrial zoning, there would be a place to do that. There would be a place for empty tractor trailers to be stored. There would be a place for material storage for construction and other things, which would not be in a industrial area, because industrial land, that can be used to, produce jobs and other things is an even tighter supply than is the housing market. So I'd like to, kind of look at that, and that may come under the comp plan into things and not under the land use. It may be something that we just talk about for a minute. The comp plan deals with a little bit more, and then we take action here to implement the light industrial district in the comp plan. But thanks everybody for being here. Always great to participate in these things. Thank you.
Councilmember Velock.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, everyone. Great meeting. Thank you for all your hard work, Holly, as always. And I will also be out of state on Monday. I will do my best to call in. Thank you.
Councilmember Crafton.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to, of course, thank Holly for all the hard work. And as long as we can get a copy of as soon as possible, because yes, I will be one of the ones that probably reads it at least twice. It's just how I am. The first time through is just understanding. The second time is I start making my own comments on it. So I like being able to read it as early as possible. I understand that's asking a lot, but if we can, that's my big request. Is as soon as we can see a copy, so that we can start looking over it. Like you said, 150 pages is not gonna. It's gonna take a lot to get through, and I understand, Jamie, we've got our minimum 5 days, but if you only get 5 days, that's 30 pages a day that you're thinking about trying to get through, which is that gets to be a lot. So thank you for all the work. It's done awesome. And to the body, I appreciate all the hard work. I think this is one of the most lively discussions we've had at these meetings. And so just thanks for being here. Looking forward to seeing this final here. We'll see you on Monday.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Counselor. Thank you, everybody who attended. I think it was a good meeting, and we'll see you on Monday.
Commissioner Sajel.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just want to thank everybody for coming out. Great comments, and we're almost at the finish line. And thank you, Holly, for all your hard work. Maybe they'll give you a raise.
Commissioner Seals.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I really appreciate everybody's hard work, especially you, Council. How are we going to pick the 12-year-old that reads the final draft so it's understood? That's my question, because early on, we wanted to make this easy enough to read for a 12-year-old. So I guess now we're gonna have to figure out who the 12-year-old is. Thank you, everybody.
Commissioner Stafford.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to Commissioner Velock and, Councilmember Velock, Councilmember Graham, for your historical knowledge of how we got what we got. And it sounds like we tried to set the bar high, but maybe we set it so high it was easier to sneak in under it. And so if we can bring it back down to where, yes, it's a bar to cross, but it's a reasonable bar to cross, it sounds like we can engage those that are currently just ignoring it. And I think that'll be, will be a good thing. And thank you, Holly, for all the work you've put into this. I can't even imagine the load it's been, so. And thank you for everyone for what you do.
Commissioner Cottle.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Commissioners and Council, and Holly. This is a great conversation tonight. I love the back and forth and the different ideas. And Councilman Crafton, you are not alone. I have been accused of being anal retentive many times in my life, as I will, even just reading this, I sit here with this packet and comparing it to the code that we currently have, because it helps me get a better grasp. Are we really making this better, or are we making it more convoluted? I think we're definitely headed in the right direction. I could probably recommend a couple of 12-year-olds when we need them, but I think this is going to be a really good finished piece, and I think it will definitely complement our comprehensive plan when the time comes, because they work together hand in hand. And just want to thank everyone for all their time and energy they put into this, especially you, Holly. You're a saint.
Holly, thank you for all you've done, because Title 16 has been a very big stick in the eye for the city, and especially the landscaping and the short-term rentals and everything, you know, because it was preventing business. So, and we've always said we're open for business. And I think the community expects it now, because they've seen where we started and where we're going and everything, and all of these, Title 16 has got to, it's got to be friendly. So I'm really happy, and thank all of you for the comments and the input and whatever, because it takes all of us. And we all come from really a different walk in life in a lot of respects. In a lot of respects we don't. So, but when you have people that are genuinely is the word I'm looking for, interested in promoting the city and where we live and making it better for everybody, not just a few, I think this shows in the conversations we've had tonight and in doing all of Title 16. So I really appreciate that from all of you. So with no further business at hand, I'm adjourning the meeting unless an objection is raised. Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned at 8:42.
Alina
Sleep here.
has left.